We often talk about AI replacement as if it will arrive like a software update. You wake up, refresh your browser, and discover your job now belongs to a cheerful interface with rounded corners. Reality, it's usually less cinematic. Most technologies do not replace people suddenly. They begin by helping, saving time, reducing effort, removing small frustrations. Then, behavior slowly adjusts around that convenience. The bigger change is not the tool itself. It is what people stop paying attention to once the tool becomes reliable enough. Human oversight tends to disappear quietly, which is very efficient right up until it isn't. The whole discussion around AI usually collapses into a simple question: will it replace us or not? That framing sounds clean, which is often a warning sign, at least in my opinion. Support and replacement are often not opposites. They overlap. A system starts by assisting with small tasks, then some decisions get delegated. Then fewer outputs are checked because the system performs well enough, or most of the time, and eventually something that once required active involvement becomes background infrastructure. By then, people describe the result as replacement, even though the transition happened gradually, through ordinary habits rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Most technologies follow this pattern. Writing changed how memory was used, calculators changed where mental effort was applied, navigation apps changed how often people needed to remember directions, instead of calmly obeying a voice that only occasionally sends them into a lake. AI is not unusual in that sense. The difference is that it operates closer to reasoning itself. It helps draft ideas, organize thoughts, summarize information, and shape decisions even. Because the interaction feels intellectual, people often tend to assume they remain fully engaged even when parts of the thinking process have quietly been handed over. At first, the arrangement seems harmless. AI summarizes documents, drafts emails, cleans up wording, and handles repetitive tasks people never enjoyed anyway. None of this feels particularly risky because the person still appears involved. But convenience changes expectations faster than people notice. Once assistance becomes constant, effort starts feeling inefficient. Tasks that previously required concentration begin to feel unnecessary to do manually, not because people consciously reject the process, but because the shortcut quietly becomes the default. Humans adapt to reduce friction with impressive speed, usually faster than they adapt to the consequences. This is where reliance, or even better said, over-reliance, starts forming. A suggestion gets accepted because it sounds reasonable, then another, and eventually some outputs stop being checked because verification feels slower than trust. Most people do not notice this transition while it's happening. The interaction still feels practical and controlled. The system works often enough that scrutiny gradually weakens without attracting much attention. Dependence rarely arrives looking dramatic. It usually arrives looking productive, which is convenient because productivity has become one of the few modern concepts people are apparently expected to applaud without asking further questions. Convenience changes behavior quickly because people naturally optimize around reduced effort. There is nothing irrational about that. If a tool repeatedly saves time, reliance becomes normal. The issue begins when trust stops being deliberate and starts becoming automatic. Judgment slowly fades into the background because active oversight starts feeling unnecessary most of the time. Nobody announces this shift to themselves. People rarely think, I will now reduce my critical thinking. The habit forms through quiet repetition, one accepted output at a time, which sounds harmless until you realize that most habits form that way. Strangely, better performance can increase the risk. The more convincing the output becomes, the less motivated people feel to challenge it. Constant verification starts feeling inefficient. If the system is correct most of the time, scrutiny begins to look excessive. But improved reliability creates a subtle psychological trap. As AI becomes more useful, maintaining active judgment becomes more important, while people simultaneously feel less inclined to use it. Ease gradually replaces scrutiny. Human beings are remarkably adaptable in this area. We can outsource responsibility with almost administrative levels of calm. This is why the narrative replacement misses what is actually happening. The more useful question is which parts of thinking people gradually stop doing themselves. Delegating repetitive formatting is one thing. Delegating evaluation without active oversight is something else entirely. Automation is not inherently dangerous. The issue is whether responsibility remains attached to the task after the effort involved starts disappearing. Once friction disappears, people tend to assume supervision can disappear with it. Apparently, Smooth outputs now count as evidence. Polished responses create the impression that the process behind them is equally solid. Sometimes it is, but sometimes the system is simply producing something coherent enough to avoid immediate suspicion. But when answers arrive quickly and confidently, usefulness tends to dominate attention, before accuracy does. Verification begins feeling optional because the interaction itself feels complete. Not because people are careless, but because convenience quietly changes what seems necessary. Small behavioral adjustments accumulate over time, and eventually people stop noticing where judgment ended and automation began. This is also why describing AI as either good or bad quickly becomes useless. Tools are rarely that simple. A calculator can support understanding or replace it depending on how it is used. GPS can help navigation or gradually weaken someone's ability to orient themselves without external guidance. AI follows the same pattern. The outcome depends less on the tool and more on the habits built around it. Repeated behavior shapes the relationship more than dramatic moments do. Most meaningful technological shifts arrive quietly while people are busy calling them convenient. There is also a reason why people prefer the replacement story. It removes personal responsibility. If AI is simply taking over, then there is nothing left to manage individually. The shift becomes external, something happening to society, rather than something shaped through everyday behavior. But working with AI still requires involvement. Attention and judgment still matter. This clean narrative is, of course, emotionally easier because it avoids that awkward middle ground where humans remain responsible, while simultaneously trying very hard to avoid additional effort wherever possible. Most of the meaningful changes happen in that middle space. Assistance slowly becomes reliance. Helpful suggestions start feeling authoritative. Systems designed to support thinking begin influencing it more directly because fewer outputs are being questioned carefully. None of this requires malicious intent or technical failure. It emerges naturally through repetition. The smoother the interaction becomes, the easier it is to forget what the system is actually doing underneath, which is generating probabilities and patterns, not understanding. The interface simply presents those probabilities with impressive grammatical confidence. And so it helps to think about AI less as authority and more as infrastructure. Because infrastructure supports action without taking responsibility of the outcome. Roads help movement, search engines help locate information, calculators help computation. None of them decide what matters or what deserves trust. AI should be approached similarly. It can accelerate planning, writing, analysis, and exploration, but acceleration is not judgment. Producing an answer is not the same as evaluating whether the answer should be trusted. Those are still separate issues, even if modern interfaces politely blur them together. This becomes easier to notice when the system produces obvious mistakes. People often say, the AI got it wrong, as if the technology failed its intended role entirely. Sometimes there are genuine technical limitations, of course, but often the larger issue is that the output was accepted too quickly. The system generated something plausible because that is what it was designed to do. What disappeared was supervision. Once oversight weakens, responsibility quietly shifts away from the user and onto the tool, which is convenient if your goal was to automate accountability as well. The conversational style of AI systems makes this easier because fluent language naturally creates the impression of competence. People associate clear explanations with understanding. When something communicates smoothly, it becomes tempting to assume the reasoning underneath is equally reliable. That assumption changes behavior, of course. Evaluation becomes less active, acceptance becomes more passive. The shift is subtle enough that most people barely notice it happening. Apparently, typing complete sentences with confidence now qualifies as expertise. And this is why thinking cannot simply be outsourced without consequences. The moment judgment becomes passive, the relationship with the tool changes completely. AI stops functioning as support and starts functioning as substitution. Even if the technology itself has not fundamentally changed, the behavioral shift usually arrives before the technical one does. None of this means AI should be rejected. That would miss the point entirely. These systems are genuinely useful. They can speed up work, expose weak reasoning, organize information, and reduce unnecessary friction. Used carefully, they can strengthen thinking rather than weaken it. But that only happens when engagement stays active. The value comes, in my opinion, from collaboration rather than surrender. A useful tool should sharpen judgment, not quietly replace it through habit while users congratulate themselves for becoming more efficient at not paying attention. One of the more important skills may simply be noticing where reliance is developing, asking where convenience is helping, and where it is gradually replacing attention. Not every delegated task creates a problem, but some forms of delegation reshape thinking more than others. Those changes are easier to manage early. Once passive habits become deeply embedded, reversing them becomes difficult because the loss of involvement no longer feels noticeable. People adapt surprisingly well to lowered participation, provided the interface remains smooth and reassuring enough. So the real question is probably not whether AI will replace people. That framing is way too narrow. A better question is which parts of judgment people are slowly handing over without realizing it. That question is less dramatic, of course, but considerably more useful. Because the future of AI will not be shaped only by what these systems can do, it will also be shaped by how willingly people stop participating in the thinking around them while still insisting they remain completely in control of the process. Thank you for watching.